So good afternoon. I'm Dustin Seaton, the Gifted and Talented Specialist at the Northwest Arkansas Education Service Cooperative.
Hi, and I'm Carly Janolis. I'm the Science Specialist at the Northwest Arkansas Education Cooperative.
And so at the Northwest Co-op, we serve all the students, teachers, educators in the public schools in Benton, Madison, and Washington counties throughout Northwest Arkansas, but we are located in Farmington. And this week we are celebrating STEAM Week. So welcome to the 1 o'clock hour of our Real World Wednesday guest speaker series as part of STEAM Week. Again, we hope you utilize the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen so you can interact with today's speaker and make connections with what you're learning in the classroom to what and how it relates to careers in the real world. Don't worry about unmuting or fixing any of your videos because we're using the Zoom feature. So you can just sit back and relax and enjoy listening to our guest speaker. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Dr. Tiffany Dickey. Dr. Tiffany Dickey is a native of Jonesboro, Arkansas, who currently lives in the greater St. Louis, Missouri area with her family. She graduated from Lyon College in Batesville, Arkansas in 2004 with a Bachelor of Science specializing in biology before pursuing a nuclear medicine technology certification from Baptist Health School of Allied Health in 2006. She then went on to graduate from the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, UAMS, with a doctorate of pharmacy degree in May of 2010. Dr. Dickey was an assistant professor at the UAMS College of Pharmacy Northwest campus for 8 years before accepting her current role as a medical science liaison for vaccines at Sanofi Pasteur. She is a board-certified infectious disease pharmacist with years of clinical practice and specializing in disease and vaccines. So please join me this afternoon in welcoming Dr. Tiffany Dickey.
Yeah. Thank you for that introduction, Dustin. I know Dustin or Dr. Seaton, I lived in Fayetteville before we actually moved to the St. Louis area and great friends with them. So thanks for having me today. A lot of people really don't understand what medical science liaisons are. And to be really honest with you guys, I didn't either when I was applying for the job. I've learned a lot about it just through the interview process and then doing this now. But it's really exciting. Like Dustin said, I was on faculty for the College of Pharmacy in Arkansas for 8 years. Spent a lot of time working with students. And the more time that I spent doing it, I found myself really enjoying that, but really enjoying the conversations that I had with the physicians. We could have deeper scientific conversations and really talk about the literature that's out there on various topics. And so I thought, maybe I want to do something a little bit different. So I started pursuing an industry job where I knew I could work more with providers. And so that's how I ended up doing an MSL job in vaccines. Now the timing was perfect. I left a year and a half ago, and I had no idea when I was leaving the College of Pharmacy that we were going to have a major pandemic that would shut down the economy and make everybody be stuck at home, and that we would be developing vaccines for a new infectious agent. So my life has been consumed with COVID, and you'll see some of that in the slides that I present. So just for you guys to better understand exactly what is a medical science liaison, there are many different backgrounds that you can be to become a medical science liaison. Pharmacists are probably one of the heaviest hitters with regards to my colleagues, as well as PhDs, so people who have more of a research background. I've worked with some great people that actually used to work at the CDC on the flu team that are PhDs, so a wide array. And then I also work with physicians. We have physicians that are MSLs, and then we also have physicians on our team that are medical directors. So they're a step higher than what I'm doing right now. So they really focus on the plan for our company. But as a prerequisite for my specific position, you had to have some type of background that was related to vaccines, infectious diseases, or immunology, because vaccines are very immunology based. You're introducing something into your immune system that will then protect you from being infected later on. So what do? I really work to build collaborative relationships with other healthcare professionals. So we call these providers either our stakeholders or our key opinion leaders. So really what I'm doing is trying to get information from them and then share information of the company and of the disease states with them to make them better informed and better able to make decisions for their patients. one thing that I think it's important to point out is that, a lot of times I thought about pharmaceutical industry really being the people who come in and they sell the drugs and they try to push providers to prescribe for certain either antibiotics or medications. And in my position as part of the medical affairs team, we are very cognizant of not doing that. We only talk about disease states. Our money that we make as an MSL has nothing to do with sales. So it's very separate from that. We do work with our sales colleagues if they maybe come across somebody who has a question or somebody they think would be beneficial to have a conversation with. But we keep the medical affairs side and the commercial, we call it the commercial side, the sales side, very separated. So what are some of the different things that I do as an MSL? Again, I act as an extension of our medical affairs positions. So we have an office that's located in Bridgewater, New Jersey. Just a little bit of background about Sanofi. It's a global company. So we are based out of France, and then we have different offices in the different parts of the world. So Bridgewater is ours. So we have a lot of these medical directors there. And then in the US, MSLs are scattered all about. So I work as an extension for the states of Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska. So pre-COVID, I traveled to all these different places. Post-COVID, I'm really doing everything remotely. But I'm really the face of the company in that territory. It's really hard to be familiar with the company and know everything they're doing without a face. So I represent that face of the company. I provide therapeutic expertise on different things, vaccine related. It could be responding to different complex inquiries that come in. It could be an inquiry about a disease state. So maybe you have a patient who has cancer and you have questions about when you should vaccinate that person with a certain vaccine. I can answer that. They also might have other questions just specifically about a particular vaccine that we carry. So I answer those as well. I do that in email, in person, via Zoom. I wish I would have bought Zoom stock before COVID hit because everything we do really is based on Zoom interactions now. So I do that. I also function again as that bridge between the medical community and the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm looking for things that providers have to say. Maybe there are unmet patient needs and they feel that there's a gap in therapy or a gap in protection with vaccines. So I take those insights back to the company and say, hey, for example, there's not a lot of influenza studies in diabetic patients, but that's a patient population who can have really severe outcomes if they get the flu. And so I take those concerns of the providers back to my company and say, maybe we should spend more time researching that. On the flip side, if that's not an area where we can currently support it, we have grants that we can offer to physicians and they can conduct their own studies. So we could either supply them with different monetary values or different vaccine products. So really they're helping me by giving me their insights, and then hopefully we're helping them by offering support for research or connecting them with maybe another specialist in that area that might be able to help them out. I also do different medical education, and I'm going to show you some different slides of the topics that we cover there. So disease awareness is really important. There are many things that people maybe don't know about vaccines. One example there is if you get influenza, your risk of having a heart attack or a stroke is actually increased by up to 10-fold in the first 7 days after getting the flu. And a lot of people don't know that. I was an ID pharmacist. I thought I knew everything about, influenza, and I wasn't aware of that. And so I can take this information out. We talked to cardiologists about it. Maybe getting a flu vaccine should be part of that order set for somebody who comes in and has some type of cardiac procedure. We talked to them about, are you stocking flu vaccines in your office since that is such a high-risk patient population? So just a lot of things that maybe people don't know, we try to bring awareness to that. We share different research that we see in the literature, but while we do all this, we have to be very fair and balanced. So I can't go in and talk really good about my product and then talk really bad about a competitor's product. So it's really important as part of the medical affairs that I stay fair and balanced. I talk about the pros and the cons of papers that focus on Sanofi products. And then if a discussion comes up about a competitor, we talk about the pros and the cons. So really staying fair and balanced. I don't want a physician just to come to me with questions about the products that we carry. I want them to come to me about questions about everything related to vaccine preventable diseases. So if they've got questions about flu and all the different vaccines that are available, I want them to come to me. I want to be the expert that they come to, not somebody from a different company. You know, I want to build that relationship with the provider. So that's really important to me.
What are some of the
So as far as disease, yeah.
Oh, sorry. What are some of the medications that Sanofi is known for that maybe some of the students might recognize?
Yeah, so for Sanofi, there are 5 different business units. So we have a business unit that's based on cardiology and diabetes. My particular business unit is Sanofi Pasteur. So again, it's all vaccines. So we have a standard dose vaccine that pediatric patients, adolescent patients, adult patients can get. We have a high dose vaccine for influenza. So I know there's a lot of commercials that come on during the evening news because obviously it's targeting a 65 and older population. Older adults tend to watch the news a lot more. So you'll see ads for those vaccines there. We also have a recombinant influenza vaccine that we're really starting to talk about a little bit more now that hasn't gotten as much attention in the past. We do Tdap vaccine, so your pediatric vaccines, tetanus vaccines. It covers whooping cough, some of those types of routine vaccinations you have to get. We cover meningococcal vaccines. A lot of schools and states require that students be vaccinated against meningococcal disease because if you do get the disease, it can be passed on to other students very easily. We do travel vaccines, so things like yellow fever. We have a dengue vaccine, so diseases that are spread by mosquitoes. And then we're currently developing 2 different COVID-19 vaccines, which is really exciting because that's everything that is, you know, all the discussions are around right now. So we get to go in and talk to different providers about our vaccine techniques if they have those questions. One thing we do, because like I said, we don't just go in and say, hey, let's talk about my high dose vaccine today. We go in and say, hey, let's talk about flu. And then when you're talking about flu, different conversations could come up. So one example that we talk about often is vaccine advocacy. In the current setting of COVID, we're seeing that there's a lot of hesitancy towards COVID-19 vaccines. And depending on how this plays out with all the science and, you know, these vaccines are being studied, they're going to look at safety from a perspective of the preclinical trials. So phase 1 and phase 2 studies that tend to just last a couple of weeks, couple of months in this setting, and then moving into your phase 3 trials where you're looking at efficacy. If we give a vaccine to everybody and it comes back that maybe this vaccine wasn't as safe as we thought, or it didn't protect you from disease as much, it's not just going to affect those COVID vaccines, it's going to affect all vaccines. So people may be more hesitant to get vaccinated for the flu and those types of things. So we really do educational topics around confidence, how to make your patients more confident, how you can talk to them about these vaccines, how you can try to overcome some of the hesitancy that's out there. You have people who are hesitant and are willing to go ahead and move forward with the vaccine. And then you have people who are hesitant and they're not willing to budge from that. So really understanding your audience and focusing on the ones who you could potentially change their mind. We also, like I said, talk a lot about flu. I think it's important to understand how flu vaccines work. So we talk to people about that. You'll see different vaccine efficacy. So that means how well is the vaccine working. For flu, we see a lot of flu during flu season, despite people being vaccinated. But one thing a lot of people don't understand that we talk about with providers is you get the flu vaccine and you may not be fully protected from the flu. You still may get it. There are breakthrough cases, meaning you're vaccinated and you still get sick. But what flu vaccines do is it really helps prevent you from getting severe disease. So if you get the flu, but you've been vaccinated, you're less likely to end up in the hospital. You're less likely to have some of these severe complications that we can see. So we try to help providers understand that and to educate their patients on it, to understand, hey, I might still get the flu, but I'm not going to be in the hospital sick on a ventilator. One thing that we don't have a vaccine against currently is RSV. So we like to still talk about these disease states, especially if different products are being developed for these disease states. It's really important to understand the burden of disease around these, and if providers think that we should be putting time and effort into creating these vaccines. Aside from influenza, RSV is one of the biggest things that we see in the winter making people sick. There are some thoughts that RSV, when you get it as a kid, can cause lifelong problems like asthma, for example. And so really trying to understand the importance around that and moving forward to make decisions as a company, whether we pursue that or not. We talk about whooping cough. So pertussis specifically, there are large outbreaks of pertussis that happen every year in schools. So this is one of the vaccines that's required for kids to go to school. We look at why maybe these vaccines don't work as well as they should, where we're seeing outbreaks, and just answering general disease state questions around that. Another one that everybody has to get in order to go to school is meningococcal vaccines. This is when you have, there are different types of meningococcal disease, but if you get infected with one of these bacteria that causes this, you have severe inflammation in the brain, in your CNS system. And so there can be a lot of severe complications. You may not die from this, you may, but if you get it, you may have amputations that can occur, because it doesn't just affect your brain, it affects all of your body organs. A lot of people end up disabled after this. So really discussing the importance of that. There's different types of meningococcal vaccines. Some you get when you're a kid, some you get when you're an adult, going into college. And so really just trying to talk to providers and see what they're talking to their patients about for these types of things. And then for travel health, we talk about different vaccines that need to be given to a patient if they're traveling to various parts of the world. You know, I've gone to the Dominican, Jamaica, multiple places, and I never really thought, hey, I should look and see what vaccines I need to get before I go to these places. And I bet a lot of people don't think about that either. And so we do a lot of awareness around that. And now if I plan to travel again, I know that there are certain vaccines that can help me be safe. So I'll get some of those. An example of one of those, like I mentioned earlier, is dengue, which is a mosquito-borne virus. And then last, all of our focus really since March has been on SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. So we do a lot of education on what it is. We talk about masks. There's some new stuff that have come out on masks saying, not only are you preventing disease from happening if you wear a mask, but you're also probably not going to catch COVID if you're wearing a mask. So there is more data coming out now showing the effects of masks. So we talk about that because it can be related to prevention of COVID. One unfortunate event that has happened because of COVID is poor vaccination rates. A lot of people aren't going into the doctor anymore because that's where the patients with COVID are going, right, to be tested. So people just don't want to go into the healthcare system anymore. And because of that, we're seeing low rates of vaccination occurring. We're seeing offices be short-staffed. And so one doctor that I talked to this past week said, you know, we can only schedule appointments to check out these kids for their well child visits if they're ages 0 through 4 years. So, you know, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, they're not seeing those kids to make sure that they're up to date on their vaccines. So we're talking with them to figure out how we can reestablish some of these vaccine rates. And one thing that's come out of that is now pharmacists can actually vaccinate kids who are younger than what they typically did. So they can vaccinate all the way down to age 3 now. So, you know, talking about how pharmacists can be really important in doing this, making people feel safe going into pharmacies to be vaccinated, talking with pharmacists to figure out how they're letting these kids' primary care physicians know that they've been vaccinated. So all types of conversations going on that you may not think about that happen. So that's just some of what I do in my day-to-day job. It really varies from different things. But I'll just stop talking and answer any questions that you guys have, and I'll quit sharing screen as well.
So we had one question come up that says, what is the scariest disease out there that we don't know about besides COVID? Or what's a fascinating disease, perhaps?
Well, we don't know about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, one thing that comes up, because if I don't know if you guys have watched the show Pandemic on Netflix, but they talk about these disease hunters. So there are these guys who go out. A lot of diseases transmitted by birds and specifically bats. And so there are all these guys who go into different caves and they test bats for different infections. They'll tag ducks in Louisiana because birds can spread disease to see what's going on in those organisms. I think it's really, flu's really scary. We had the H1n1 pandemic that happened back in 2009. The thing that is nice about that is when people are going out and testing these, there are pandemic vaccines that are being developed that aren't marketed because we don't need them now. But there are already vaccines that are in existence that could cover some of these influenza pandemics that could come up if we see another spread of disease. I will say SARS-CoV-2, so COVID, is a really terrifying virus. There were a couple of years ago, well, multiple years ago, in 2002, there was an epidemic called SARS. So remember SARS, it got a lot of attention again out of China. But it really was over by 2004, and you didn't see that many people get sick, and you didn't see that many people die. And that was because the people who spread the disease were really sick, so they would go and get put in the hospital, and you could contain those patients. That's really different from what we're seeing with SARS-CoV-2, because you can spread disease if you're mildly sick. You can spread disease if you're asymptomatic. So it's really hard, unless you're testing every person that's out there, to know who has the disease and who can spread it. It's a respiratory virus, and so it's very different than most respiratory viruses. When you think about the flu, Dustin, what do you think about? What illnesses do you think about, or symptoms?
Oh, the backaches, high fever, cough, everyday things that could happen.
Yeah, runny nose, sneezing.
Yeah, runny nose.
SARS-CoV-2 is so different from that. Yeah, everybody said it was, it's like a flu virus, but it's not. It's causing severe coagulation disorders. So never has there been a respiratory virus that causes people to have blood clots the way that they are, and being as sick. So, there are some long-term effects. We're seeing athletes who get this and they're not recovering. They're still having a diminished lung function, a couple of months out from having the disease. So I think there's going to be a lot of long-term effects of this that we're not seeing right now that we may see down the road. So I think this one is the scariest so far, but there probably are other things out there we just don't know about yet.
So we've got a couple of questions just in the Q&A asking about how challenging it is to make a vaccine, and then just kind of, I guess, piggybacking off of that is what is the challenge with creating a vaccine for COVID-19?
Okay. So the challenges with vaccines is that you just really don't know if something's going to work. So if you think about the vaccine pathway, so let's talk about that for a minute. You start out with a candidate target. Well, first you have to identify a target. So what is it that we want to create a vaccine against? And multiple people have, many ideas, and you could have up to 100 ideas in this target type of thing that you then take into preclinical testing. So you're testing these different ideas out on animals. So in these animal models, you expose an animal to this infection and you see how they respond. You hope that they respond like a human would. After you see the response, you then will have your vaccine that you've created and you'll inject the animal. And then you expose the animal to the response again. And you hope that you have some protection from that vaccine. You go from hundreds of candidates in doing this into phase 1 studies. So these are early studies trying to figure out what dose you need to do. At this point, you may only have 20 candidates that exist now out of those 100 because things just didn't work the way they thought they would. They didn't elicit an immune response. From then that phase 1, so where you're trying to figure out a dose, you go into phase 2 studies. So you're looking to see how safe this is. From there, only 1 out of every 15 drugs that are tested in phase 2 actually move on to that phase 3 testing where you're doing efficacy. So things just keep falling off because maybe it wasn't as safe as you thought, or maybe you were not able to elicit an immune response. It just wasn't effective in doing what you wanted it to do. So you just start out with hundreds of things and you get down to 1. With SARS-CoV-2, there are more than 200 vaccines being explored currently. And there are more than 100 companies that are exploring these different techniques. So some companies, like for example, my company, we have 2 different ones that we're working on, but we're doing it with partners. We're not doing it alone. One of the challenges with vaccines take a long time to prove that they work. They take a long time to produce. Some of these vaccines that we're seeing right now, so you guys have probably heard a lot about Pfizer. Pfizer's in the news right now. They've explored a platform called mRNA technology. So for the science people out there, in order to create a protein, so for SARS-CoV-2, there is this protein, it's called the spike protein, and it's what allows that virus to get into the cells and cause infection. They're basically creating these vaccines. So you start out with a linear piece of DNA that's a template that codes for that spike protein. In a test tube, they'll put it in, and the conversion from that DNA into mRNA will happen. They then can inject you with that vaccine. Your body will then convert it from mRNA into a protein. So essentially, they've made it to where your body's producing that spike protein on its own from this piece of DNA that they created and turned into mRNA. From there, because you're producing this protein, your body will then produce antibodies against it. So that helps protect you. So they call these plug and play vaccines. So you know the gene of interest that you want, you plug it in through this platform and you test it out. One of the struggles with that is that it's a new platform. There have never been any vaccines that were approved in the United States using that technology. So I think one of the biggest issues with it is proving that it's safe and proving that it can be efficacious. And that's what a lot of the questions are coming from the FDA. You know, this is a new platform. This is something we haven't done before. Is it going to be safe and efficacious? So I think that's the biggest challenge right now, is showing something that we haven't done before can be safe and effective.
Right. And that's seems to be it's something that I know for me, like I've heard, just things like my parents took, because they didn't know any better, back then. And I know we've just advanced so much further in 2020, but still, as you said, it takes a long time to prove that something is safe, because that requires time and it requires many trials or many people. And so that was kind of another question, that how long does it take before a vaccine can be released for it to be considered safe, or that it has met the efficacy standards, I guess.
It normally takes from that preclinical time where they're really discovering the product to get licensed. It takes generally more than 10 years, anywhere from 10 to 20 years. So that's a long time. And we're trying to create a vaccine now in 12 to 18 months. So you guys have probably heard of Operation Warp Speed, which then kind of freaks people out. It's not gotten a really positive name. Vaccines have become very politicized in this, since the pandemic has started. But Operation Warp Speed is essentially taking that route that I told you about, from preclinical into a vaccine being approved, and they're shortening the time. So they're not really shortening the steps. You're still doing all the steps that you have to do, but you may be doing them at the same time. So for example, some of this mRNA technology has been tested in humans before. Nothing's been approved, but it has been tested. So some companies opted to do animal studies and human studies at the same time. So things are happening, together. And then we're seeing manufacturing happen a lot early. And a lot of this has to do with financial risks. It costs a lot of money to run clinical trials. It costs a lot of money to produce vaccine. And so as part of Operational Warp Speed, they are basically pumping money into companies. So some of these companies have gotten upwards to $2 billion given to them from Operation Warp Speed. So it's different government groups coming together, different global collaborations providing money. So they're really creating and manufacturing these vaccines at the same time that they're testing it out. So there is a risk if the vaccine's not safe or if it's not effective, you're losing millions of doses and millions and billions of dollars just in drug that can't be used or vaccine that can't be used. But that's what they're trying to do. They're basically coordinating clinical trials. So everybody is going to look at the same outcomes of interest, so everybody can see how these vaccines compare a little bit more commonly than what you might with, you know, a million different manufacturers looking at a million different outcomes. So it's really interesting to see this process go from 10 years to 12 months. I mean, there's a good chance that we could see a vaccine authorized for use at the end of November.
Really?
And that's less than a year, right? We didn't really start this until March. Yeah.
Wow.
So don't quote me on that, but it's
No.
going to happen soon.
I mean, this
If you're interested in this type of stuff, there's right. There is some great vaccine people. So Paul Offit is a name. If you love vaccines, if you like the stuff I'm talking about, he is a great guy to listen to. He actually created the rotavirus vaccine that you give kids so that they don't get that GI sickness. But he is on this committee called VRBPAC. So in order for vaccines to be approved for use, the FDA makes their approval, and then a group called ACIP, which is an advisory committee that works for the CDC. They're the ones that offer the recommendation. So if you're 6 months old, you should get this vaccine. But Dr. Offit is on a group of VRBPAC, so it's external stakeholders to the FDA. They're all scientific backgrounds. They make their recommendation if they think a drug should be approved or not, or a vaccine should be approved or not based on the scientific data. They have been asked to hold 3 dates in November and 3 dates in December, suspecting that they're going to be talking about these emergency use authorizations. So these vaccines aren't going to be approved for use, but there is a pathway to approval. So it's an emergency declaration has been declared, which we have for this pandemic. And then if these vaccines can be proven safe and effective within certain requirements that the FDA requires, then they can be used outside of that approval. But they'll have to say specifically, we want it for this patient population. So one group we're seeing excluded that you guys might care about is pediatric patients. So I think the lowest age that's being studied right now, I believe, is 12. So we won't see vaccines for kids under 12 anytime soon, unless somebody else decides to go with that, you know, earlier age group.
Well, some of the questions we've gotten that I think relate to the same topic is that on average, what's the percentage of the population that generally gets a vaccine for like the seasonal flu? What's the projection for what they would anticipate that would get a COVID vaccine whenever it does come out? And how much of an impact would that be? Is there like a threshold of a number of the percentage that we need to get to help us somewhat get back to normal?
Mm-hmm. So I'll just use influenza as an example. There are, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Healthy People goals. So we have a Healthy People 2020, and they look at different things like vaccination. How many people do they want to be vaccinated? For influenza, the Healthy People 2020 goal was 70% of the population being vaccinated. We're not anywhere near that. In your elderly patients, so those who are 65 and older, they're the most likely to be vaccinated for influenza. We see their rates anywhere around 69 to 70%, so they're close. And that number hasn't really moved over the last 10 years. In our younger population, we don't see it that well. You know, in adults who have high-risk conditions like cardiovascular disease or diabetes, we're only seeing around 40% of those people being vaccinated. So despite there not being high rates of vaccination, when everybody started social distancing and wearing masks back in March, the incidence of flu just fell. It went from being at its peak to just falling and being nothing. So we know these measures can work. Kids aren't being vaccinated how they need to. Pediatric patients for flu, of the kids who die, I think there were 186 kids the last time I looked who died from flu last year. 80% of those kids weren't vaccinated. So it really is important to get vaccination, even if you're healthy. I think half of those kids who die had no pre-existing health conditions. So not doing well on those vaccines. Other vaccines that are required for school, for example, like your MMR, we see high rates of that simply because you have to have it to go to school. There are some exemptions in some states, like religious exemptions, but still high rates for those vaccines. For COVID, there is a really, really big issue right now with hesitancy, like I mentioned, and that was one of the things that came up at that VRPAC meeting. We really need to do a good job as healthcare professionals educating on the importance of this, clarifying some of the misinformation or disinformation that's out there. Not all of it is intended to be bad information. Some of it is just maybe information that they thought was true, but really isn't. So we call that disinformation. With regards to how many people need to be vaccinated, it depends on several things. So in order to determine herd immunity, so how many people need to be vaccinated to protect the entire population, it depends on something called R0, so that's the reproductive number. And you may have heard this number being discussed in the news, but it's how many people one person who is infected with the virus can infect. And that number really varies across the US. On average, I believe the reproductive number is 5, but in heavy suburban, not heavy suburban, but heavy metro areas where you have a high density of population, that number is higher. And then in rural areas where people are spread out more, that number is lower. But on average, the last time I looked, it was 5. Then it depends on the vaccine efficacy. Pfizer reported 90% at 7 days post second dose. So these vaccines are probably going to be 2-dose vaccines. So, you know, it's going to depend on what that R0 looks like and what that vaccine effectiveness looks like. So I don't have a good answer for you. There's some different math equations that you can do to get that. But one of the examples that Dr. Offit talked about on his was if you had a vaccine that was 70% effective and your R0 value was 2, you would need 67% of the population to get vaccinated in order to have herd immunity. But we're seeing much higher R0s, so that number could be higher. But if you have a much more effective vaccine, if it truly is 90% whenever we get out to longer data, then maybe it's not as many as we thought. But it does sound like herd immunity may be possible with this vaccine.
So one of the students asked.
So for this profession, you've got to be good at math and science.
That's true, very true. One of the students asked, will everyone have to get a COVID-19 shot if that R0 number is so high, minus maybe the 12 and under age group? But is that a discussion like among infectious disease experts of requiring that as one of the shots for going back to school or going back to the normal profession and lifestyle?
It has come up under emergency use authorization. Since it's not an actual approved vaccine, it's not a licensed vaccine, you can't require somebody to be vaccinated with it. So that's one of the things with the emergency use. The other thing is we don't require flu vaccines for kids to go to school, right? It's a seasonal illness. There has just never been a big push, or there may have been a push, but it wasn't actually approved by anybody that had to be required for kids. So I don't know that there will be a requirement. You just hope that people look at the data. You know, there's a lot of arguments like COVID is bad, but what percentage of the population really is dying? It's not a high percentage. But you're not taking into account all the resources that are being utilized. In some of these cities right now where there are just numerous cases and they're setting up tents outside, those patients aren't getting the best care. And so we're likely to see mortality rates climb over the next couple of weeks when more people are being infected, because you don't have all the resources that you need to provide the best care for these patients. You're missing out on some of the long-term effects. So really it's not a requirement, but it's just making people confident enough to see how severe the disease can and what you can do to help protect yourself and your family members from getting it. So I don't think that it will end up being something that's mandated, and it can't under the EUA.
And they're talking about the 2-dose, 21 days apart from the first to the second. Is that something that's expected as a potential annual thing? Or is that like a one and done? I know the flu is an annual projection, but we don't know what we're looking at necessarily with COVID-19.
Yeah, we don't. There's a lot of questions as to when this pandemic is over and we're able to have herd immunity and be protected. Is it something that's going to go away and it won't be an issue again? Like SARS, for example, we don't see a lot of people worried about SARS now. We just don't know. It could be something that, you know, it sticks around. Nobody expected it to survive in the summer. We thought it's an airborne virus. once it gets hot and humid, those particles weigh more, they'll fall to the ground, it won't hang around as long for it to be transmitted, and that just wasn't the case. So it could be something that circulates all the time. We don't know as far as the vaccines. One of the difficulties that you hit on, Dustin, is that it's a 2-dose series. So not only do you have to get a patient to come in once, you have to get them to come in twice. And then you've got to keep track once more vaccines are approved for use. The patient has to get the same vaccine because they are different. So you want to make sure if they're getting a Pfizer vaccine for their first dose, they're getting it for the second dose. And then the question goes back to that efficacy. So right now we know Pfizer has been efficacious, 90% efficacious at 7 days after that second dose. I care more about what does it look like at 3 months? What does it look like at 6 months? Is it something where you're going to have a waning effect? So maybe it's really effective early on, and a year from now, maybe you don't have any antibodies for it. The other thing too is making sure that people who already had COVID are still comfortable with getting vaccinated, because we don't know what that natural immunity looks like. We don't know if that's long lasting as well. So just so many unknowns. And these are the types of conversations that I have, in my conversations with KOL. Some of the stuff I'm talking about are points that they've brought up. And so that now we have to think about that as a company on how to proceed with some of this stuff.
So let's talk about you then as an individual, because as a young student, did you envision yourself going into this route into infectious disease, or what motivated you and inspired you to go into this field of study?
From a young age, I always enjoyed watching shows. I don't know if you students may not remember this show or may not have heard of it, but ER was a show that I loved watching when I was a kid. Doogie Howser, he was a young kid who became a doctor. So just those types of shows. And so I always thought, I want to be a doctor. And then I got into college and had to start dissecting animals and seeing blood. And I thought I was going to pass out and die. And I was like, I cannot do this. So I immediately decided that that wasn't the way that I wanted to go. I got my biology degree because I had already started pursuing that. And then, as Dustin said, I went into nuclear medicine, but at the same time I was working in pharmacy. Nuclear medicine technologists are the ones who will inject you with radioactive material, and then they put you in a scanner, and they can look for issues with your gallbladder, they can look for cancer, multiple different types of things. But while I was doing that, I really cared more about the drugs that we were using than the procedures that we were doing. So I decided, okay, well, I've done this, let's go on and do pharmacy school now. So then I went on to do pharmacy school and really loved it. As you can tell, I really love talking about the science behind it. I'm not really the type of person to sit behind a pharmacy counter and count pills and counsel patients. I really like to hear about the science part of it. So that's kind of what led me to where I'm at now. But I would say, if I have any advice for you, like try to figure out what you want to do early. I love that you guys are doing these types of talks. I wish I would have known what I wanted to do earlier on. I'm still paying on student loans, and hopefully I'll have them paid off soon. But I spent so many years in school, and I'm thankful for all of that because I've learned a lot. But I'm still paying on student loans. So, really ask questions, dig into this stuff now, and really try to pave that pathway for yourself so you don't end up like me paying on student loans in 2020 when I graduated finally in 2010 at the end of everything.
It's so great. Thank you so much. We're coming to the end of our hour with you, and we are so thankful just for all of your insights and all of your advice. Are there any final thoughts, or just anything that we can tell our students and our teachers before we leave?
I just echo what I said a minute ago. For you guys who are interested in stuff, don't be afraid to really get out there and be vulnerable and, ask for opportunities that maybe you don't think you could do. If you're a science-oriented person, reach out to different people and talk to them about projects they've worked on. When you go into college, find a professor, find you a mentor. I think that's really key. One of my mentors I still communicate with. They've always been really helpful. they helped me identify people that I could work with. I did different projects, different research projects throughout my time as a student. It makes you a much better candidate. Don't be afraid to get out, be involved, be in science clubs or math clubs or whatever it is you want to do. Take part in quiz bowl, those types of things. Don't be afraid to be a big nerd. I think is something I do. Everybody laughs because I wear these big nerdy glasses, and I'm like, I'm happy to be a nerd. Because I feel like I know so much more than people who are afraid to get out there and do these types of things. So don't care what other people think, like do what's going to make you happy in the end and make you the best candidate for whatever it is you want to do.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Tiffany Dickey, and all the students that tuned in today. We appreciate y'all giving us your afternoon, especially Dr. Dickey. We know you're working hard from home and doing the frontline work to help us come up with a vaccine and inform our healthcare professionals. So thank you for all the work you're doing professionally, but also taking your time today to talk with us as students and educators in Northwest Arkansas.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. We'll see you later.
Well, thank you guys.
Bye.